In June 1965, the quiet neighborhood of Houston, Texas, was shaken to its core by the sudden disappearance of Fred and Edwina Rogers, an elderly couple that had lived quietly in their suburban home for many years. When their neighbors grew concerned after not seeing or hearing from them for several days, they contacted the local authorities to conduct a welfare check. What they discovered in the Rogers home would go on to shock the city and remain one of the most bizarre and unsettling murder cases in American history. Upon entering the house, there were no signs of struggle, and everything appeared to be in its place, except for one chilling detail: their refrigerator. Inside, the officers found the dismembered body parts of Fred and Edwina, carefully packed grotesquely. Their limbs, heads, and torsos were arranged with unnerving precision. The discovery was not just tragic, it was outright horrifying, as the bodies had been severed with an almost surgical level of detail, which led investigators to question the motive and the mental state of the person responsible. The scene was more than just disturbing, it was methodical. Unlike crimes of passion, where the victim might have fought back, or where the killer might leave signs of a hasty attack, this seemed calculated. There was no blood outside of the fridge or signs of a violent altercation, but the victims had been gruesomely dismantled. The killer had taken time to carefully cut the bodies apart carefully, even choosing to store them in the cold confines of the refrigerator, a place meant to preserve food, not human remains. The choice of using the fridge was particularly chilling, as it symbolized the killer's cold, detached nature. They didn't just commit the crime and leave. It was as though they wanted to ensure the bodies remained hidden in plain sight, as if mocking the authorities. For the police, this raised more questions than answers. Why would the killer dismember the bodies and place them in the fridge, where the remains would eventually be discovered? Was it an attempt to hide the crime, or was there something more sinister at play? The eerie calmness of the crime scene left the authorities struggling to understand the motivations behind such brutality. As the investigation unfolded, one thing became clear: the police would have to dig deeper into the Rogers family life, especially into the relationship between Fred and Edwina's only son, Charles Rogers. Charles was known to have a strained relationship with his parents, particularly his father. Many of the Rogers' neighbors had seen Charles argue with Fred in public, particularly about money and the financial dependence Charles had on his parents. Fred, a staunchly independent man, had been the primary financial provider in the household, and Charles had grown increasingly resentful of this. Some neighbors even reported that Charles had become reclusive and had trouble maintaining stable employment. However, while the strained family dynamic suggested a motive for murder, there were still many unanswered questions about whether Charles was the killer or merely the victim of a tragic set of circumstances. The authorities quickly zeroed in on Charles as the prime suspect. His behavior was erratic, and he had a history of mental health struggles. He was known to have mood swings and had been heavily dependent on his parents for years. Some reports suggested that he was living off his father's financial support, but he wanted more freedom and control. This dynamic seemed to have created a growing tension between Charles and Fred. Charles had been living with his parents for several years, but many close to the family reported that the living situation was far from harmonious. Fred was known to be domineering, and Charles felt stifled by his father's control over his life. While there was no direct evidence linking Charles to the murders, at first, the police couldn't ignore the fact that he had been the last person seen with his parents. As days passed and Charles failed to show up for questioning, the investigation turned to him with increasing suspicion. The missing persons report on Charles Rogers was filed almost immediately after the discovery of the bodies. His sudden disappearance raised more questions, and his neighbors and friends were unsure if he was alive or had simply fled. The authorities launched a nationwide search, but Charles's whereabouts remained a mystery. Was he on the run, fearing arrest for the murders, or was there another, darker explanation for his disappearance? No physical evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, no weapon was found that could definitively tie Charles to the crime. He had vanished without a trace, and the police were left to piece together the puzzle. They speculated that Charles may have fled the state, or, in a more sinister turn, that he had met an untimely end himself. As the investigation continued, the specter of Charles's guilt loomed large over the case, but the lack of concrete evidence made it impossible to make an arrest. As the police began to piece together the chilling evidence found at the Rogers house, the focus quickly shifted to Fred and Edwina's only son, Charles Rogers. Given his strained relationship with his parents, particularly his father, Fred, Charles had quickly become the prime suspect. Many of the neighborhood's residents had witnessed frequent arguments between father and son, especially surrounding financial matters. Fred was the family's financial provider, and Charles was increasingly dependent on him, which caused tension between the two. Charles's resentment toward his father's overbearing nature had been noted by several people, and it was well known that Fred had strict expectations for his son to contribute to the household in a way that Charles struggled to fulfill. Charles's mental health was also a point of concern. He had a history of erratic behavior, mood swings, and depression. Some of his friends and acquaintances reported that he was reclusive, rarely socializing, and often retreating into his world. This kind of isolationism only deepened the mystery around him, as no one seemed to know exactly what Charles was thinking or how deeply his issues with his family affected him. His isolation only worsened over the years, and by the time of the murders, it seemed that Charles had become more and more estranged from the world around him. This sense of isolation made it difficult for anyone to foresee a violent outburst. But those close to the family were aware that something had been brewing beneath the surface for years. It wasn't hard for the police to imagine that Charles might have harbored a deep resentment toward his parents, especially his father. In the wake of the murders, the police attempted to track Charles down, fearing that he might have fled the scene in an attempt to avoid the authorities. His sudden disappearance seemed to confirm their suspicions, but there were no leads on his whereabouts. Charles had left no trail for the police to follow, and it appeared that he had vanished into thin air. The case quickly became more complicated as the investigation into the crime continued. Charles's financial troubles were another key element that drew suspicion. Friends and family confirmed that he had often struggled to make ends meet, and Fred had provided substantial financial assistance over the years. Many believed that Charles was relying on his father for his survival, and there was speculation that Fred's control over his finances might have pushed Charles over the edge. However, the lack of direct evidence linking Charles to the crime complicated the situation. At the time of the investigation, police couldn't pinpoint any concrete evidence that directly connected Charles to the dismemberment of his parents. No fingerprints were found on the weapons or on the refrigerator, which made it difficult for investigators to place him at the crime scene. This lack of evidence left many questions unanswered. Did Charles commit the murders, or was there another explanation? Had someone else entered the house and carried out the crime? Or had Charles been involved in some way? While Charles had been the last person seen with his parents, the lack of physical evidence kept the case from moving forward. The police continued their search for Charles, and with each passing day, the mystery surrounding the murders deepened. Adding to the complexity of the case, investigators discovered that the police hadn't been the first to search the house. A family friend had entered the home before the authorities, and they had failed to uncover the gruesome discovery. Had the killer been trying to leave the scene in a hurry, or had they been confident that they had removed all traces of evidence? Why hadn't the family friend noticed anything unusual when they first visited the house? The unanswered questions about the crime scene only made the case more puzzling. Was Charles involved in the murders, or was he the unfortunate victim of a twisted scheme that had yet to unfold? The investigation would take twists and turns as the police tried to answer these questions, but the lack of evidence in Charles's disappearance left the case shrouded in mystery. As the days turned into weeks, the search for Charles Rogers intensified. Police and authorities scoured Houston and surrounding areas, following every lead and tip they received. The possibility that Charles had fled the city, attempting to escape the mounting suspicion, was considered highly probable. His sudden absence raised questions about whether he was guilty of the murders or if something else had happened to him in the aftermath. The police were relentless in their pursuit, but despite their efforts, they were unable to find any solid evidence that pointed to Charles's whereabouts. No phone records, no known associates, no physical evidence. Charles had seemingly disappeared without a trace, as if he had vanished into thin air. Charles's disappearance further complicated the investigation, as the police were now left with two possibilities. Either he was the perpetrator of the gruesome murders, or he had somehow been involved in a tragic sequence of events that led to his parents' deaths. Some theories suggested that Charles had been a victim of foul play, possibly abducted or killed by someone else after committing the murders. Others believed that he had gone into hiding, knowing that the authorities were closing in on him. The fact that Charles's financial situation was dire only fueled the theory that he might have taken drastic action to end his struggles, potentially killing his parents to gain access to their money and assets. However, there was no evidence to support this theory, and the investigation remained at an impasse. The nature of the murders also posed additional challenges for the police. The dismemberment of the bodies was a particularly grotesque detail that suggested a level of premeditation. The killer had not simply killed the victims in a fit of rage or passion. They had planned the act, carefully executing the dismemberment and storing the bodies in a refrigerator. This methodical, cold nature of the crime seemed almost surgical, as though the killer had taken great care in ensuring that every part of the body was removed with precision. The choice of a refrigerator as a hiding place only deepened the mystery. Was this a deliberate attempt to preserve the bodies, or was it a twisted joke? The lack of blood at the scene was another perplexing element. How could such a violent crime occur with so little physical evidence left behind? With each passing day, the mystery deepened. Charles's sudden disappearance, combined with the bizarre and grisly nature of the murders, left investigators grasping at straws. Theories were abundant, but none seemed to explain all of the facts. Was Charles guilty, or was he a victim of an even more sinister plot? The case would remain unsolved for many years, leaving behind an air of uncertainty and horror that lingered over the city of Houston. As the investigation continued, the authorities began to encounter even more challenges in determining the truth behind the Icebox Murders. Charles Rogers' disappearance loomed like a dark cloud over the case, casting doubts on every lead the police followed. While some believed that Charles had fled the state, hoping to avoid the repercussions of his parents' brutal deaths, others wondered if he had simply been the victim of something far more sinister. Over time, the case began to unravel in unexpected ways, as new information came to light that suggested there was more to this crime than initially thought. One of the most perplexing elements of the investigation was the fact that Charles's financial situation had not been as dire as initially assumed. The police discovered that Charles had had a large sum of money shortly before his parents' deaths. This money, however, was not his own. It was a check from his father, Fred Rogers, which was later discovered to be the final attempt to resolve the ongoing financial disputes between father and son. Fred had agreed to provide his son with a large sum of money to help him get back on his feet. But this did not necessarily explain the violence of the murders. Could the financial dispute have been enough to drive Charles to kill his parents, or was there another deeper issue at play? The money theory only added complexity to the case, as it suggested that financial motive alone couldn't account for the horror of the murders. The more investigators dug into Charles's personal life, the more questions arose. Neighbors recalled seeing Charles acting unusually calm and collected just days before the murders. Was it possible that he had been pretending to be mentally stable, or had his mental state deteriorated so drastically that he had lost all sense of reason? One of the most intriguing pieces of information that came to light was Charles's interest in the occult, something he had kept secret from everyone, including his parents. Some reports claimed that Charles had dabbled in black magic and occult practices, raising questions about whether this had played a role in the murders. Was it a supernatural influence, or was it simply an indication of his increasingly erratic behavior? The police found it difficult to discern whether Charles's obsession with the occult had led him down a path of violence, or if it was merely a symptom of his deteriorating mental health. Despite these growing doubts, the police still could not connect Charles to the crime scene conclusively. There was no solid forensic evidence that placed him at the scene of the murder, and Charles's sudden disappearance left them grasping for answers. Was he guilty of dismembering his parents, or had someone else committed the heinous act? The lack of forensic evidence at the scene, such as blood or fingerprints, made it impossible for the police to confirm their suspicions. In the absence of hard evidence, the investigation began to stagnate. New theories emerged, some suggesting that Charles had been part of a larger, more sinister conspiracy. But without a clear suspect, the case was left open. The search for Charles continued, but as weeks turned into months, it became apparent that the truth behind the Icebox murders might never be uncovered. The passage of time would do little to solve the Icebox murders, as the case eventually went cold. Charles Rogers was never found, and the gruesome murders of his parents remained a chilling reminder of a family torn apart by violence and mental instability. Some believed that Charles had indeed murdered his parents in a fit of rage, or due to his growing resentment of his father's control over him. Others argued that his disappearance and the lack of evidence suggested that something else was at play, a darker, more complex conspiracy that had yet to be fully revealed. Years after the crime, a few theories gained traction, with some investigators and criminologists suggesting that Charles might have been killed by an accomplice or someone with a vendetta against the Rogers family. However, no one could explain the bizarre nature of the dismemberment and the cold, calculated manner in which the bodies were disposed of. The fact that the murders had been committed with such precision and the bodies hidden in the refrigerator only deepened the mystery. Was this a crime driven by personal motives, or was it part of something larger? The absence of definitive answers left a lingering sense of unease in Houston, where the case became a local legend of sorts, discussed in hushed tones among residents for years to come. Some years later, a man who claimed to be an acquaintance of Charles came forward with a shocking revelation. He alleged that Charles had confessed to him in a drunken stupor that he had indeed killed his parents, but he had been too frightened to face the consequences. However, without any concrete evidence to corroborate his claim, this statement was dismissed as unreliable. In the end, the mystery of the Icebox murders remained unsolved, a testament to the chilling nature of the crime and the complexity of human behavior. Had Charles Rogers truly been the murderer, or had he been the victim of an even darker fate, the case would forever remain one of Houston's most eerie mysteries. Even today, the Icebox murders continue to capture the imagination of true crime enthusiasts and remain a symbol of the unspeakable horrors that can sometimes lurk behind the most seemingly ordinary facades. For years, people have speculated about what happened to Charles Rogers and why such a brutal and methodical crime occurred. Some still believe that the case will eventually be solved, while others contend that the truth will remain forever buried in the cold, dark recesses of history. The Icebox murders case has remained an enigma for decades, with no clear answers emerging about the fate of Charles Rogers or the true motives behind the brutal deaths of Fred and Edwina Rogers. The investigation may have gone cold, but the chilling details of the crime continue to haunt those who delve into it. For those who are fascinated by mysteries and the dark corners of human nature, the Icebox murders serve as a grim reminder of how easily the line between normalcy and insanity can blur. Whether you believe Charles Rogers was the perpetrator or simply a tragic figure caught in a web of mental illness and familial conflict, the case remains one of the most unsettling in American crime history. If you are captivated by this case and the quest for answers, don't hesitate to dig deeper into the world of true crime. The Icebox murders may be cold and forgotten in the annals of law enforcement history, but for those who continue to search for the truth, the case remains a symbol of the mystery that lies at the heart of human darkness. Have you ever heard of the Icebox murders before? Do you think Charles Rogers was the killer, or do you have a different theory? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling true crime stories. Share this story with others, and let's keep the conversation going, because some mysteries are just too chilling to leave unsolved. Have you ever heard of the Icebox Murders before? Do you think Charles Rogers was the killer? Or do you have a different theory? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling true crime stories. Share this story with others, and let's keep the conversation going, because some mysteries are just too chilling to leave unsolved.